So, good afternoon. I extend a very warm welcome to all those who are present this afternoon for this talk on the subject from Dayanand to Aurobindo, Rethinking the Origins of National Education by Dr. Ankur Kakkar, who is a fellow with the Center for Contemporary Studies, PMML. He has been doing research on similar topics for a number of years. His topic of research here, the exact topic is Rethinking Nationalist Education, a study of indigenous enterprises 1880 to 1980. Ankur has received his doctorate degree in history from the South Asia Institute, University of Heidelberg, Germany. And his doctoral work was on Dayanand Anglo-Vedic School of Lahore, a study of education reform in colonial Punjab 1880 to 1920. I would just like to say a few things to foreground the subject of origins of national education from Dayanand to Aurobindo. So when we take this period or these two people from Dayanand to Aurobindo, essentially we are talking about the period from 1870s up to virtually 1950, because 1950 is the year when Shri Aurobindo departed from the world. And in 1875, Swami Dayanand Saraswati founded the Arya Samaj in Bombay. Of course, he had been thinking about these subjects from an earlier period, and many of his writings, letters, etc. have come down to us, and over the course of decades I have had the opportunity to see some of them, to read some of them, and these are very interesting and sometimes very original, innovative ideas about the course of education, character building, etc. that the country should take, according to Swami Dayanand Saraswati. Let me just add that I also think that in the recent decades at least, probably, Swami Dayanand Saraswati's thought and his great influence on the reform movement of the Indian society has not been given as much attention as it should have been given. He was in fact one of the giants of modern India, whose impact is long lasting, because the Arya Samaj that he founded was actually one of the most important influential organizations with a large mass base from almost from the beginning, from 1875 till at least the 1950s. Of course, in the last few decades, one could say that both the spread of the organization and its influence has declined somewhat, but I would say that one of the reasons this has happened is that it was quite successful. So as they say, certain things, when they are successful, naturally, having achieved the success, there isn't much more that they could do. So there is inevitably a decline. It is probably a law of nature anyway. So Swami Dayanand Saraswati's ideas on national education are important. But the larger question is, why did the need for a national education arise? What was the reason behind this debate of national education? What is it that we had which was not satisfactory, and therefore many of these enlightened Indian minds thought of creating national education? So basically, the most important thing there is, if we go back to the debate in the late 18th and early 19th century among the British administrators, intellectuals who were associated with India, policymakers, and the Indian, I would say, intellectuals and others who were interested in the subject of what should be the education system in India. We noticed that the fundamental axis of the debate had been on the utility of the traditional Indian mode of learning, which India had inherited from millennia of evolution. So I think in one of the talks, Ankur also talked about it, how every village had its school or toll, as they were called in Bengal, and these were supported by the local gentry, by the public, and of course there were madrasas and such other things also, which he did not include at that time. So there was a well-developed system of education, both at the primary level, at the secondary level, and at the advanced level. I dare say that India had among the most, or probably the most developed system of imparting education at various levels in the pre-modern world. I don't want to go back to when the universities were founded here, etc. We all know that. But the important thing is that when the debate is started between the utilitarians and the Orientalists and the Indian intellectuals and people like Ram Mohan Roy, then the question was, by and large, except for the utilitarians who had a condemnatory kind of approach towards Indian learning tradition, dismissive, as Macaulay later said, so ridiculously that without having read anything or having known anything, that one good bookshelf of European books is equal to the whole knowledge of India and Arabia. It is difficult to come across a more stupid statement. From somebody who was otherwise so erudite and knowledgeable, a great writer. But I presume maybe it was the compulsions of imperialism, or maybe it was in a moment of in a moment of error that he, whatever it is. But this was the debate. So you see that from the early 19th century, and Raja Ram Mohan Roy was obviously somewhere between the two. He wanted some features of Indian education system to continue, but he believed that the traditional Indian knowledge was not so useful in the modern world, and therefore modern Western sciences, etc., must be taught in a fairly intensive manner for India to open up and for India to modernize. The second important aspect there was the presence of Christian missionaries, because there was an umbilical cord between the utilitarians and the Christian missionaries. Till the time of the dominance of Orientalists, the Christian missionaries till 1813, if I remember correctly, they had been kept in check up to a very large extent. But in 1813, for the first time, I think 1 lakh rupees, this figure may be wrong, but I vaguely remember 1 lakh rupees were assigned to the evangelical activities of the Christian missionaries, and of course they were allowed to propagate, and we know how they started propagating by force, fraud, and sort of demonization of the indigenous traditions of learning and of worship, etc., etc. So therefore, many Indian intellectuals, scholars, and reform figures had been trying to evolve a system that would allow India to be rooted in its millennia-old knowledge tradition, both in terms of system and structure and in terms of the essence of knowledge, philosophy, epistemology, and at the same time adopt from the modern world, from the Western world, whatever was found to be good and necessary. I think, broadly speaking, this has been the effort of most of the Indian leaders, reformers, thinkers, philosophers. The two people that Ankur is going to talk about today, I think he's not going to be confined to the two, but you can see that these were two of the most important persons. But I would say there were hundreds of important people who thought about it and who tried to in a way, who tried to forge a new self, modern Indian authentic self, with the help of an education system which would have the best elements of Indian learning tradition, epistemology, its a system, and at the same time absorb whatever was good in the modern Western knowledge. So national education was conceived by different people in different ways. There was an evolution across time, but there were also vast differences among people on what national education should be. So national education in a way was seen as an integral part of the evolution of India as a modern nation state in the context of a colonized society. So with these words, let me once again welcome everyone and request Ankur to proceed with his lecture.
Namaste. Thank you, Dr. Ravi Mishra, for this wonderful introduction and for giving a background to my talk today. I thank all of you for coming to attend this talk. Today's topic is on the rethinking the origins of national education, and more specifically on understanding the definitions of national education that were given by nationalist thinkers in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I'll use my presentation to give my talk. Basically, I will structure this talk in 4 or 5 sections. I'll first talk about what is generally understood in academic discourse on national education. Then I'll talk about the fundamental principles of indigenous or pre-colonial education. And then I'll discuss about how the visionaries of national education in the late 19th and early 20th century based their vision on, what were those values. And then I'll do a sort of comparison between some principles of indigenous education and the fundamental values of national education that were the foundation for this vision that was laid down in the 20th century. So this is broadly what my lecture is going to cover. So let me begin first by giving you a brief background about why this lecture is important, because well, national education means many things for many people. A lot has been written about it, and because there are so many views about what constitutes national education, so yeah, this is important to understand how it was originally defined, and also to what extent national education was based on the ideas or principles of pre-colonial education in India. An example, there are many examples of how it has been defined by academic scholars. One particular example is from a work that says the idea of national education, like that of the nation, is a comparatively recent historical innovation. In India, the idea of national education emerged not to promote loyalty to the state as in Europe, but in opposition to the system of education introduced by the colonial masters, unquote. It is evident from this quote that one of the definitions of national education that has been understood is that it was a response to colonial rule, and it was developed as an alternative to colonial education. So one of the understandings, it is common understanding, is that national education means an alternative to colonial education, as in a response to some colonial oppressive laws because of which we had to come up with our own system. That is one of the definitions. And according to this definition, there are some certain characteristics of this understanding. One, that national education is considered to be a sort of a controlled by the nation state, an administrative kind of system. It tried to instill patriotism and inculcate this national pride in students. It was part of course, the Swadeshi movement. That is one of the characteristics of this definition, this understanding of national education, and it was part of the anti-colonial struggle. So this is the general understanding of national education. Now, Of course, there were various kinds of nationalists who were initially trying to respond to colonial education in various ways. Some of the early nationalists, such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy, as Ravi sir has mentioned, or even Gopal Krishna Gokhale, were not really trying to develop an alternative to colonial education, but initially the response was more of in favor of colonial education, and in fact many of these thinkers advocated for the further expansion of English education. For example, Gopal Krishna Gokhale also wrote a letter saying that it should be further expanded, and there was a debate between efficiency and expansion, and some of these thinkers focused more on expansion of the existing colonial system of education. This was some of the early nationalist responses to colonial education. In the late 19th century, however, we see a much wider variety of responses, especially with the coming of the first Indian Education Commission that was established in the year 1882. Now, this Education Commission, also known as the Hunter Commission, invited testimonials and witnesses from various parts of India. Provincial reports were published across all the provinces, and all these testimonies that were recorded, they were highly critical, especially the Indian testimonies were highly critical of colonial education during that time. Some of the major points of criticism that these testimonials recorded was that colonial education system lacked any kind of moral or religious instruction. It lacked any kind of practical and useful instruction. Also, it created a rural-urban divide. So basically the complaint was that the students who were getting out of these colleges and schools, they were not receiving any kind of moral instruction. They were useless because they were not able to get employed, and also they were not able to pursue the skills that they had to do that they were otherwise able to imbibe in their village education, in their Pathshala system, that was the indigenous education system. So basically the complaint was that they were they were useless for both their own society, their own village, and also they did not get any practical skills. So that was a common complaint. So these complaints generated a kind of a series of responses in which the nationalist institutions tried to inject these ideas into their models of national education, which they were trying to develop as an alternative. So, for example, some of the nationalist institutions tried to instill or inject separately moral and religious instruction as a separate subject so as to redress this problem. Some of the nationalist institutions try to inject practical and vocational instruction so as to redress this problem of not having useful instruction in the colonial education system. So this was broadly what the nationalists, how they were trying to respond to colonial education. Also, national education is understood to be a political response, especially it started as a response to Lord Curzon's University Act of 1904, in which the government was trying to strengthen their control over higher education, and a lot of political participation was there of students at this time, and we know this is part of the Swadeshi movement. It is also claimed that this movement was largely restricted to the Bhadralok class. So this is one of the characteristics of this movement as it is understood in the academic discourse. The National Council of Education was established in Bengal in 1905, and it had the following objectives. It claimed to fulfill the following objectives: to inculcate physical, moral and religious education, to instill patriotism, to use the vernacular medium, to include Indian literature and impart scientific professional education, etc. So these were some of the objectives of the National Council of Bengal. Now, this was a certain, to give you a glimpse of the variety of nationalist responses, but at the same time, there were also visionaries of national education during this period, and that this vision was gradually developing, in which the thinkers of national education wanted to develop an idea that was rooted more in the civilizational roots, or based on the ancient principles of Indian education. So their vision of national education was not limited to only a critique of colonial education or a political response to boycotting some government institutions, but their quest was larger. They wanted to understand how to develop this vision of national education based on Indian foundational principles of pre-colonial education. So I am going to focus more on these visionaries who wanted to revive the system of indigenous education in a new form in the modern period. So I'll give you a brief glimpse of some of these thinkers. Of course, the list is very long and it's not possible to cover all of them in one talk, but this is just to give you a brief timeline and look at some of the major visionaries who were trying to do this. So maybe I can list some names here. So starting with Dayanand Saraswati, who wrote the Satyarth Prakash in 1875. Swami Vivekanand, we have his educational writings in his complete works. Then Sister Nivedita, I don't know if you can see the dates, but they are too small to be visible. Annie Besant. John Woodruff wrote his The Seed of Race, an essay in Indian education. Rabindranath Tagore, of course, wrote many writings, and one of them was Shiksha Herfe, but there are so many others. Satish Chandra Mukherjee, he was one of the founders also of the Dawn, and also initially involved in the Swadeshi movement in Bengal. Anand Kumaraswamy, and of course, finally ending with Sri Aurobindo, who wrote many writings on education. One of the prominent is a preface on national education. So this is to give you a brief timeline of how successive thinkers in the 19th and 20th century developed their vision of national education, and how this whole vision developed one by one. The main characteristics of this vision was that it was not limited to only politics or rooted in the anti-colonial struggle. They wanted to imbibe the spirit of Indian education and also revive ancient ideals. They sought to revive the ancient ideals and principles, and they wanted to include the disciplines of Indian knowledge system. Okay. So before we come to the fact that how they were trying to revive indigenous education, or how they were trying to revive some principles, let us first look at what were these principles of indigenous education that they were trying to revive. So in my previous lecture, I had discussed about the indigenous education tradition, and I had discussed about the surveys of indigenous education that were carried out by the British, and also other records that were available in the early 19th century that showed us a picture of indigenous education or pre-colonial education in the early 19th century. And based on that data, we can summarize certain principles that were found to be in common in these indigenous institutions. And of course, they were imbibing some ancient principles also. So one of the principles was the idea of the integral self, or also which is called as the whole Panchakosh framework, that is rooted in the Indian literature, Indian texts. There are many Indian references to this, particularly in the Taittiriya Upanishad. We find mention of the detailing of the Panchakosh framework and how it works, and how it has been used to understand or to define Indian education. The whole idea of inner education and ethics was something that was found in these indigenous institutions. So the practice of rituals, of performing yagya, of doing japa and pranayam and yoga was part of this, of the daily, their pedagogy that was considered to be an integral part of their methods of education. And this I have discussed in my work on indigenous education. I don't have time to go into details here, but maybe you can contact me separately for that. The other idea was of the Gurukula, of course. So it was not possible to receive education without the Guru, and one had to live in the Guru's house, and that was the Gurukula Vas was considered as an essential characteristic of pre-colonial institutions, whether it was tolls or pathshalas or gurukuls, whatever the kind of institution it was. The other characteristic of indigenous institution was self-reliance or self-governance, meaning that these institutions were not dependent on external government funding or external agencies to support themselves. They relied on local financial arrangements to sustain themselves, and that obviously depended on the whole structure of the local economy of that time. So this was a model that was there. The other thing was that these indigenous institutions were dependent on a variety of modes of knowledge transmission, which means that one could learn through various modes, not necessarily through a didactic instruction between a teacher and a student, but through various modes, whether it could be fairs, temples, or any other exercises. So, looking at these principles, let us now compare how these were found or how these were reflected in the speeches and writings and works of the nationalist thinkers that we have discussed earlier. So, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, let's start because I'm working in a chronological manner. Dayanand Saraswati wrote his Satyarth Prakash in 1875, in which he detailed the whole scheme of education comprising of around 20-21 years on how the education should be conducted. He emphasized on inner education, on ethics, especially on values such as brahmacharya, and he emphasized that young children should emulate the good habits and righteous practices of their parents. And also in the third chapter of his Satyarth Prakash, he says that they should be taught the Gayatri Mantra, and then he says successively there should be exercises for yoga, pranayam, and especially the use of yajna was considered very important in the institutions that the Arya Samaj started later on. We find this is in common with the practice that was prevalent in the indigenous institutions. So this was an interesting way in which they were trying to revive some of the principles of indigenous education. They included the educational philosophy of Dayanand Saraswati, included the practice of Sandhya, and this has been discussed in the fourth chapter of his book, the Satyarth Prakash. The idea of the Gurukula Vas or the Guru Griha Vas is also found in the works of Satish Chandra Mukherjee, who pioneered, who started the Bhagavad Chatushpathi and other tolls that were modeled on the lines of the ancient tolls and gurukuls. So there was a very, very conscious endeavor to revive these indigenous institutions. Okay, now let's go to the next thinker of this period, that is Swami Vivekanand. In his works, Swami Vivekanand has also emphasized on the idea of inner education, and in fact he says, to me, I'm quoting from his work now, he says, to me the very essence of education is concentration of mind, not the collecting of facts. If I had to do my education over again, and I had any voice in this matter, I would not study facts at all. I would develop the power of concentration and detachment, and then with a perfect instrument I could collect facts at will. So then he says, side by side, this is the child should be developed the power of concentration. Now you see, this idea, this emphasis on inner education, on developing the inner instruments of perception, which is called antahakaran in the Indian terminology, was a very integral feature of the indigenous systems or the pre-colonial systems. And we find this mention in the writings and speeches of the visionaries of education of this period of the 20th century. Similarly, Swami Vivekananda emphasized on yoga. He says that this is his emphasis on the importance of yoga for education. And also, Swami Vivekananda talked about the importance of the Gurukula Vas. He says, my idea of education is personal contact with the teacher, Guru Griha Vas. Without the personal life of a teacher, there would be no education. He's very clear about it. So these thinkers were were very clear about the fact that how their idea of education and their vision of education included these fundamental values or principles that were already part of the indigenous system that they were trying to revive. So there was no confusion in their mind about how they wanted to bring about a national regeneration or a renaissance, at least in the field of education. Rabindranath Tagore also appreciated many features of indigenous institutions, particularly the fact that these institutions used diverse modes of knowledge transmission. He highlighted the fact that they used modes like fairs, kirtans, and recitation of epics, and he sought to revive them in his institutions and also in his models of village reconstruction at Sri Niketan. Okay, I think this is. Yeah, so now let's go to Sri Aurobindo. Of all the thinkers, I think it was Sri Aurobindo who wrote the most on education and also who developed this whole vision in the most comprehensive manner. So I'll quote a lot from his work because especially it's important because of the foundations of national education that he gave. So let me quote from, you can see this on your screen. He says, "It is the spirit, the living and vital issue that we have to do with. And there the question is not between modernism and antiquity, but between an imported civilization and the greater possibilities of the Indian mind and nature. Not between the present and the past, but between the present and the future. It is not a return to the 5th century, but an initiation of the centuries to come." And then he goes on to say that this is the aim and principle of a true national education, not certainly to ignore modern truth and knowledge, but to take our foundation on our own being, our own mind, our own spirit. So clearly, what Sri Aurobindo is trying to say is that the foundations of national education have to be based not on values that we have imparted from colonial education, but on the values that we have inherited from our own systems of indigenous education. Of course, he doesn't use the term indigenous education, but what he's essentially saying is that our philosophy of education should be based on our own, on values of our own systems. Now, this is another interesting quote of Sri Aurobindo because you see, as I stated earlier, the indigenous education system was based on this, on the Panchakosh model of the Purush, and Sri Aurobindo also in his philosophy uses the same model in different words. Okay, what he says is, India has always seen in man, the individual, a portion of the divinity enwrapped in mind and body, a conscious manifestation in nature of the universal self and spirit. Always she has distinguished and cultivated in him a mental and intellectual and ethical, dynamic and practical, and aesthetic and hedonistic, a vital and physical being, but all these have been seen as powers of a soul that manifests through them and grows with their growth. And yet they are not all the soul, because at the summit of it arises to something greater than them all, into a spiritual being, and it is in this that she has found the supreme manifestation of the soul of man and ultimate divine manhood, his paramarth and his highest purusharth. So his definition of the individual and his definition of man is in complete agreement with the Indian model of the Panchakosh framework, and that was used in the indigenous system to define the education model. And Sri Aurobindo also defines his education system on his definition of the individual or his definition of man. And again, quote from Sri Aurobindo, he says, "It should be clear that the only true education will be that which will be an instrument for this real working of the spirit in the mind and body of the individual and the nation. This is the principle on which we must build, that the central motive and the guiding ideal. It must be an education that for the individual will make its one central object, the growth of the soul and its powers and possibilities, for the nation will keep first in view the preservation, strengthening, and enrichment of the nation's soul and its dharma, and raise both into powers of the life and ascending mind and soul of humanity. And at no time will it lose sight of man's highest object, the awakening and development of his spiritual being. Unquote. Again, it is evident from this quote that Sri Aurobindo's vision of education, being that the ultimate object being knowing the spiritual self, was in common with the object of education in the indigenous tradition, where also this idea of knowing the self is considered to be the highest objective. So, although he did not mention records of indigenous education in his speeches, but what he was essentially trying to do was, in his endeavor to revive the spirit of Indian education, he was stating, in other words, the same principles and emphasizing that any vision of national education that we are building has to be based on these values and on these definitions, on our understanding of the human personality. He also talked about the instruments, the inner instruments of perception, the four antahakaran, that is the inner instruments of perception, which is again in common with the idea of inner education that we found in practice in the indigenous system. Now, it's very interesting what Sri Aurobindo had to say on moral and religious education. If you remember, we have discussed earlier in this lecture about this common complaint of nationalists that moral and religious instruction was not being given in colonial or government institutions. And to redress this problem, they sought to inject moral and religious instruction as a separate subject in these institutions. Now, Sri Aurobindo had a unique take on this. So what he had to say was that according to the indigenous model, or according to his idea of national model of education, the moral and religious instruction was not a separate subject. So even when one looks at the indigenous institutions and the pre-colonial institutions that we have surveyed previously, we find that there was no such separation between secular and religious subjects. There was no such separate subject of moral or religious instruction that was found in any of the institutions of pre-colonial India, because moral education was not something that was given separately as a preaching. So what Sri Aurobindo says in this quote is also the same thing. What he's saying is essentially, he says, and I quote from his work, he says, the singular compromise made by the so-called national education of Bengal, making the teaching of religious beliefs compulsory, but forbidding the practice of anushthan or religious exercise, is a sample of the ignorant confusion which distracts men's minds on this subject. The prohibition is a sop to secularism declared or concealed. No religious teaching can be of any value unless it is lived, and the use of various kinds of sadhana, spiritual self-training, and exercise is the only effective preparation for religious living. Unquote. So what he's essentially saying is that when you look at the practices of indigenous institutions in which these rituals or these practices or these sadhana exercises were part of the curriculum of their pedagogy, that was how they imbibed that in the student and did not merely preach about them. So just like in the indigenous institutions, these exercises and these practices were part of the curriculum, they were part of practice, not just preaching. In the same way, Sri Aurobindo in his writing emphasizes that moral and religious instruction is not something to be taught as a separate subject, but something to be practiced, to be lived. So again we see that there is this continuity and this emphasis on the same values that were existing in the pre-colonial institutions. Okay, this is again the same thing. So, yeah, he's just elaborating more on this idea. Okay, I think I'll probably conclude my lecture now. So,
Anything else you want
I
to
have to just add a conclusion.
Okay.
So, that's okay, it encourages me only. So, I would like to conclude this lecture by saying that.
Let me say, I thought that I was late in clapping.
Okay.
So I alerted myself,
Okay.
because it's a must. But
Okay.
go ahead.
So basically, I would like to conclude by saying that just like indigenous institutions emphasized on the idea of self-reliance and self-governance, so did nationalist institutions, especially this vision of education being given from Dayanand to Sri Aurobindo, emphasize on this idea of people taking their own responsibility for education and thereby being self-reliant and self-governed. Secondly, they wanted to revive the spirit of Indian education, which was their main objective, and not just develop a vision of education that would be a mere response to some oppressive colonial laws or be a better version of a colonial system. So that's all I want to say. There's a lot of literature on this that I have surveyed, but of course I don't have time to go into details. And yeah, so this is what I'm developing. Thank you.
So I take this opportunity especially to thank Dr. Ankur Kakkar for his presentation.